Well, thank you. The problem with having a very good moderator who does a good introduction is you take a few of what I planned on saying over this slide. So well done. But as Liz said, yeah, so I work at Rare. Rare's been around for a while, working in over, as Liz said, 60 countries. If you haven't heard of Rare, that may be because until very recently, Rare only worked in low-income contexts. Only in the last 5 years or so started working in high-income contexts on climate mitigation as well. But I specifically lead that research team at the Center for Behavior and the Environment, which is fundamentally about sort of increasing the adoption of behavioral science across the environmental space. We spend a lot of time with both researchers and practitioners to understand how to transport behavioral science into programming so both people and nature benefit. And today I want to share with you a sort of a lens for thinking about behavioral science and the environment that looks a little different than what you might normally hear in a pop science version of our field. And by the time we wrap, I hope I've been able to persuade you that that lens is a better fit for the immense environmental challenges that we face. So when I think about behavioral interventions, I sometimes like to think about them along two dimensions. One of them is complexity. So on one end, you might have a single point intervention, so sort of a single interaction addressing a really narrow shortfall. Or you might have a multidimensional approach that's addressing a variety of difficulties in shifting a behavior. Another dimension is intensity. So you might have, a light touch, like changing some language on a form. Or you might have a multi-year engagement aiming to support fundamental shifts in a community. 15 years ago, nudge changed many people's perspectives on the plausible relevance of behavioral science for driving change in the world. The sort of promise was for low cost and low intrusion, you could shift people's behavior for the better. And with some hindsight, we can now see what that approach has yielded. A recent meta-analysis of nudge-based interventions found that on average, they yield a 1.5 percentage point change, largely on relatively low-cost behaviors. Now, given the low cost of the interventions themselves, that might actually be a good ROI. But if you thought it was going to be a widely applicable tool, you can't help but wondering if behavioral science isn't really all that applicable. But what about the black space on this graph? One of the side effects of the nudge era was, for many, it led to the equivalency of behavioral science equals nudge. But if we truly want transformative change out of behavioral science, we need to explore the rest of this space. So I want to tell you two stories from the empty areas of that graph. The first involves farming in Colombia. So in Colombia, 4 out of 5 farmers are small-scale producers. And as temperature rises everywhere, they're at very high altitudes. So the results are even more pronounced. And their harvests have become inconsistent. The techniques that farmers have relied on for generations, a generation, the heavy use of chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides are no longer offering the same benefits that they once were. And they've led to water pollution, reduction of crop resilience, and soil erosion. The second story that I want to tell you about involves small-scale fisheries across the world. So almost 500 million people depend on small-scale fisheries. However, many of these fisheries have been massively overfished, in some cases leading to near total collapse of the system. And to solve these challenges requires entire communities to shift their fundamental livelihoods. And if all you knew about behavioral science was to nudge people around the edges, you might consider these lost behavioral causes. But I want to share with you now is a high-level glimpse into how each of these challenges can be addressed through behavioral informed solutions when you're willing to bring the whole toolkit to bear. So the first that I want to talk to you about is the farming in Colombia case. And the brilliant thing about a situation like this is there exists a technical solution. This isn't something that necessarily behavioral scientists are the experts on. Other scientists are on what behaviors actually need to happen to have this sort of mutual benefit for both farmers and the environment. And the broad bucket is called climate smart agriculture. I'm not going to go into super details here, but to give you a brief summary of what it means in this context, it means ending the indiscriminate use of agrochemicals. It means applying more compost on their fields. It often means cover cropping. So that's where you might plant, for example, beans or peas along with your coffee crop. And it means only irrigating as much as is actually needed. This ends up increasing farmer yield while also benefiting the environment. So you might think, if these solutions are so great, why isn't everyone just doing it? The incentives are supposedly aligned. And indeed, many organizations focused on climate smart agriculture seem to think that is exactly the case. And they think, all we need to do is run some educational campaigns. We just need to fill this information cup and we'll have success. But instead of making that assumption, so we did hundreds of hours of interviews, thousands of surveys to really understand that the position farmers see themselves in. And we found a lot of things, but I'm going to condense it down to just one for the sake of the story that I'm telling you now, which is we found a particularly dominating part of their decision was ambiguity, specifically aversion to ambiguity. Now, ambiguity aversion is different from risk aversion, and that risk aversion involves your dislike for the possibility of losses where you know the odds, right? Whereas ambiguity aversion is not liking the fact that fundamentally you don't even know the odds. And in case of the Colombian farmers, it's an incredible, unknowable gamble to stake your entire year's livelihood on a technique that you haven't ever seen. And you certainly aren't going to trust some random extension agent who comes to you and tells you to change everything in order to adopt it. Now, based on those insights, we developed an intervention strategy that we call the social snowball. And the program that was built on that intervention strategy is called Lands for Life. Now, I'm going to give you the incredibly high-level version of how that program goes about actually enacting change, but understand that you're getting the sort of high-level gloss. But I want to give you sort of the behavioral insight into what we think is going on in that program. And that program rolls out in 3 phases. And remember, fundamentally, what we're trying to address is that ambiguity aversion. But one thing that was also clear in our surveys is there is heterogeneity in that ambiguity aversion. Some farmers were not actually all that averse to the ambiguity. They're the kinds of people who like to try things. Then you have people who are way on the other end of the spectrum. We call them ranging from low resistance to medium resistance to high resistance farmers. And the first phase of the program is targeting these low resistance farmers. And we want to ease their adoption to generate tangible evidence for success. This involves a bunch of different elements, individualized training, SMS systems that we built to reinforce composting at the right times and to reduce irrigation. These SMS were all like timely and personalized to their individual plots. But you might, if you were designing a behavior change intervention, you might just stop there. Like, okay, what we've done is created this, this training program. We've created this SMS system. Like, we'll get the amount of change we get, and that's it. But that actually wasn't what we were trying to do, right? We're trying to shift this entire community into a new livelihood. So the next thing is to take that tangible evidence for success and turn it into social proof for our medium resistance farmers. So the next phase of the intervention involves showcasing that increasing number of farmers making the shift and sharing their stories through radio, through community events, really trying to change the impression of the entire community that this technique is 1, effective, and 2, growing in popularity among their own community. Now, if this all works, then you've converted the medium resistance farmers over to this technique over that next period of growing period. But then comes what we call the high resistance farmers, where even with all of the social proof, that's insufficient for bringing them along with the rest of their community. And then we convert into this phase, which we call social pressure, which is the targeting of high resistance farmers with a complete shift in messaging of the program, actually towards the community-wide understanding that participation of all farmers is required to reap the community benefits. Notice when I was talking about some of the downstream negative effects of the current practices, they weren't all internalized, right? They affected people around you. So like the pollution of water, for example. So focuses on what will be lost at that collection adoption when that falls short, allows the community to create their own self-reinforcing norm that can bring along high resistance farmers, as well as coming together as an entire group to reinforce over time that the intervention will actually persist even when rare isn't there as a presence. So the second case that I want to talk to you about is the fisheries case. And again, we're in the position of there's a known technical solution for how you can solve a case of overfishing. I'm going to talk about one of those cases that we use in Fish Forever called managed access and reserves. So with managed access and reserves, basically you're specifying that only a certain group, usually the community that is directly adjacent to a given fishery, one is allowed to fish there, and two, that there is a reserve area in which no one is allowed to fish. And how this works is that reserve area ends up, the fish don't respect the buoys, the fish actually leave the reserve area, and then people are allowed to catch them. But if you specify the right size of the reserve area for a given fishery, you can actually ensure sort of an optimal level of fish catch out of a given fishery. So both rebuilding the biomass as well as supporting the community that relies on it. But again, that's not a behavioral solution, that's a technical solution. You still need people to, for example, not fish in the reserve. And oftentimes you end up with what we call in this space paper parks, where yes, there technically is managed access. Yes, technically there's a reserve. But one of my favorite quotes from an interview we did when we asked people, why do people fish in the reserve? Someone pointed out, that's where the fish are. Which I thought was a really deep insight into, fundamentally why this sort of cooperative dilemma is challenging. And that points you to what is our behavioral challenge here. And it is fundamentally one of cooperation. We can all do better by not fishing in the reserve and respecting managed access. But individually, I do better by fishing where the fish are. And that's something that, as a behavioral solution, we need to address this dynamic. So these insights are embodied in that program called Fish Forever, which currently operates in 12 countries, I believe, and is working with has worked with over 150,000 fishers. And this program involves this strategy that I'm calling coordinating the norm shift, but understand that for both of these, it's not that we're developing this entire approach. Instead, we're standing on the shoulders of people who have been thinking about fundamentally what does it mean to do norm change in the behavioral sciences. And the first step that we see in this program is generating collective demand. And notice that that's not just generating demand for a reserve, but collective demand. What does that mean? Well, it means that not only individually do I think that I would like a reserve, but two, I think that the people around me think that we should have a reserve as well. So you might do that through activities like Fish Forever does with what's called a fish game. So with members of your own community, you'll play in this simulated environment of your own fishery, where you can see how the fishery does with different sorts of rules that could govern the fish catch. So they're having a reserve, whether reserve is respected, etc. And importantly, that doesn't just change an individual's perception on would I benefit from a reserve, but they're playing it socially, right? So they're observing the reactions of everyone else in the community playing that same game, and they're updating their social beliefs, our collective understanding of where our community ought to be, that collective demand. But again, when you do purely information-based interventions, oftentimes this is where even programs that put themselves out as being deeply community-based, that they stop. They're like, well, we've done it. We've generated the demand. The community will take it from there. The community won't necessarily take it from there. In fact, the next step that we see as core is coordinating a shift. Because something you have to understand is, even though I may believe that everybody in my community thinks that we should respect the reserve, I'm not interested in being the only person in my community respecting the reserve. I don't do better in that case. I just do worse if everybody else is still fishing in the reserve. Instead, I need all of us together to shift our behavior at the same time. So nobody is sort of left out as everyone else is free riding on that public good. So you could coordinate the shift through events like public pledges, where each individual member of the community speaks to the rest of their community saying, I pledge from this point forward to not fish in the reserve. And that generates this collective understanding that, okay, all of us will be changing our behavior at the same time. And if this step succeeds, you now actually do have a shift in behavior. But you notice I mentioned there are 3 steps in this intervention strategy, but there's only 2 here. And that's because if you stop here, this new norm is incredibly unstable. You can just get a few people starting to fish in the reserve, and that just leads the entire thing to cascade down. So what we need to do is strengthen this norm. This involves things like community-based monitoring, where each individual in the community knows that if I were to fish in the reserve, my other community members would find out. And that sort of social enforcement would kick in. So this can involve things like putting up buoys. So you might think of, oh, well, buoys are just telling people where the reserve is. It's just an information thing. And you've really missed something fundamental, because when you actually interview fishers, they are very knowledgeable about where different areas on the place that they've been fishing for decades, where you could describe to them very well where the reserve area was, and they would know. But instead, what the buoys do is they make it, they eliminate any possibility for an excuse. So if I'm fishing on the opposite side of a buoy, I can't say like, oh no, I thought it was a little bit farther over or something like that. There is a buoy. It is large. It is orange. Like, you knew that you were actually fishing in the reserve. So we've eliminated that plausible deniability and allowed social enforcement to make this norm actually strong and persist, again, once rare is no longer involved with this community. So what I'd like to leave you with is some more general insights that we've sort of gathered both from working on these programs, but also having the amazing opportunity to collaborate with a lot of other organizations working on their programs as well. Of, if you need to do, or if you're trying to do this sort of deep change where you're trying to shift entire communities, not just on trivial behaviors, but on things like their fundamental livelihoods, what do we see as common elements in those programs that succeed? So the first is their frequent leveraging of social dynamics. So whether that's the social snowball in Lands for Life or norm change in Fish Forever, we're harnessing the unique human socialness and our intense desire to learn and conform to the expectations of those in the community. The second is layering complementary strategies. So when we think about nudge approaches, you do sometimes see multiple nudges bend together. But these approaches often neglect to trying to build something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So in a case like Fish Forever, it isn't just that we need to build demand and we need to coordinate a shift, but those two things interact in such a way that they need to be done in a particular sequence to achieve change. Similarly, in Lands for Life, the conversion of low resistance farmers are themselves part of developing the social proof that's necessary for later phases of the program. So you're thinking about, how are these different components interacting to build something that is overall effective for the entire community? The third is that they engage complete systems. So many interventions I see show what I like to call last actor bias. So where they only focus on the person most proximate to the desired change. So I haven't gone into all the details about these different programs, but for example, in the case of Fish Forever, we not only need to work with fishers, but also buyers, also community leaders, also the community members who aren't actually involved in fishing themselves, as well as policymakers. So an entire different stream of Fish Forever is about devolving authority to actually manage policy. So engaging with national level policymakers to devolve authority to these local communities to manage their own fisheries. Similarly, in Lands for Life, it's not just about engaging with farmers, but also the extension agents who work with them. the local government to support and access these communities, the suppliers that actually bring these resources like agrochemicals, but also like fertilizer to support these farmers in their changes. So my closing contention is this. We need a complete behavioral science informed toolkit for addressing environmental challenges. That toolkit includes nudges, but when you want transformative change where people are changing things that deeply matter to them and their livelihood, it likely requires more intense, complex styles and the interventions like the ones that you see here. And I'll leave you with one final note, that if this is the kind of thing that's particularly interesting you, the Center for Behavior and the Environment is running a massive beehive event focusing on exploring how behavioral insights can be applied to address environmental challenges in DC in June. And if it seems interesting to you, then we'd love to see you there. And with that, I appreciate all you taking the time to think about these sorts of challenges, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.